today for the You Remembers events. It's been a really wonderful beginning yesterday with our roundtable, and I want to take a moment and thank Randy Silverman, my co-chair, who has just worked beyond to make all of this work possible, and also the Office of Diversity, who supports this event with incredible staff and attention to detail. In a moment, we'll have the keynote speaker, but before, I just wanted to let people know that at 2 o'clock, we'll have an open dialogue available, and it will be convened in, I'll get this information, it's in the social work building, room 1559. I have some little flyers that I'll put in the back of the room. You can pick those up. And it's a chance to process, ask questions. It's facilitated by our Director of Peace and Conflict Studies, who is very gifted in helping people engage some of perhaps the intense issues that are raised by any number of the presentations that we have. But now I'd like to invite our distinguished professor, Catherine von Stockton, who is the Associate Vice President for Office and for the Office of Equity and Diversity, to introduce our key speaker.
So let me see if this is working. Does that seem to be, you can hear me?
Yes.
In the back? Okay, great. I do want to thank, of course, Mayor Schreiber. Let's not leave her out of the thanks here, whose labor and thoughtfulness, very much with Randy's and Neelam Chand's and the other members of the committee, Karen Balin, who've done just such an incredible job to craft this event. So I've been graciously asked to make a few remarks on my way to introducing our speaker. Here at Utah, we like the form of the engaged introduction. It's a way that we show respect to our speakers, to show that we have thought about the issues that they are bringing to our table. So in just about 5 minutes, you will hear from our remarkable speaker. Let me begin. I didn't want to go at all, but I desperately wanted to go. So we went. And I found myself where many visitors to Auschwitz, that iconic concentration camp, find themselves. On the railroad platform, where the Nazis sorted and sundered families. In one direction, you were sent to labor. In the other direction, to the gas chambers. And at this point in May, when I visited, the chambers were surrounded by luminous trees. I had seen this spot in so many movies, but there I was, where things went down, and I went a little mad. Several thoughts were flooding me. I thought of Tone, of all the crazy things, our little tour guide, who is this sweet, young Polish woman, and I thought of her job. You have to convey important facts about the camp. You can't assume they're known, but you have to hold them in a tone. Outrage and dignity have to be blended and held by your voice. I was undone by the tour guide's throat, which became my weirdly maniacal focus. And then there were the aching asymmetries that got to me. I have written on Holocaust fiction in relation to fiction on American slavery. Cynthia Ozik's The Shawl on the one hand, and Toni Morrison's Beloved on the other. Morrison started writing her novel just 2 years after Ozik's famous story appeared in The New Yorker. So many fascinating liquid echoes of Ozick in Morrison. Wretched breasts, not enough milk, threads of wetness linking mothers losing babies. In the one story, the mother's baby is grabbed by a Nazi and splashed against an electric fence, while the mother swallows her daughter's shawl so this mother won't scream. In the other, the mother, who will be soaked in blood, kills her baby, saws its neck, to save it from enslavement, which is why the baby returns to haunt her. The difference between them? In Ozick, the worry is that memory will leave you, escape your body, when you want to hold it in. In Morrison, the worry is that memory will enter you and ravage your body beyond repair. hold it in, keep it out. There's something hugely different here that we might want to contemplate, that might make the thou must not forget of Holocaust remembrance not quite applicable to American slavery. Yet there's a point where both texts cross. They both reveal the paradox of our having to kiss the words of diaries, oral histories, testimonials, even novels that are going to hurt us, that describe the most unimaginable actions that we must imagine. That is why the baby who turns out to be memory coming back in the form of a baby who's the memory of millions of slaves, is called beloved in beloved. She is to be kissed, and kissing her may ravage you, because you must kiss such hateful words in reaching her. And then there is a crisis in scale. My last point. I went to Zion National Park over fall break, and I was asking myself, why do I keep going back to Zion and all these national parks? I've been to Zion over 30 times, and every time it blows my mind. How is that possible? And I realized that the beauty in Zion National Park, many of our national parks, is on such a scale and has such intensity that your mind literally cannot remember it from time to time. So each time you go, you are stunned anew. And it made me think weirdly of the Holocaust and slavery as crises in scale, which takes me back to the railroad platform. A crisis in scale took place on a spot. Somewhere a memory is desiring you, and there is peril, and there is scale, but there's no escaping, and we are not running, we are kissing, we're transfixed. And thus I'm intensely grateful for our speaker, Dr. Beverly Mitchell. We are in good hands. She is a professor of historical theology at Wesley Theological Seminary, located in our nation's capital. What does she profess? Dr. Mitchell teaches courses in theology, church history, African American religious history, feminist theologies, poverty, and human rights. She's the author of many publications, but let me mention two. Her book entitled Plantations and Death Camps, Religion, Ideology, and Human Dignity, and the World Council of Churches ecumenical document, a theological challenge to the persistence of racism, caste-based discrimination, and other exclusionary practices. She's currently serving a second term as a member of the Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust Committee at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I am in awe of her moving willingness to try to think these matters with and through each other. Please now welcome Dr. Beverly Mitchell.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. I want to thank you, Dr. Stockton, for your evocative and powerful introduction to introducing me. I appreciate that, and may we keep some of those images in mind as I talk this afternoon. I also want to thank Dr. Miera Schreiber for her invitation to participate in this university's Holocaust Remembrance events this year. This has been an important way not only to keep before us a significant defining moment in global history, but has also given us an invitation to examine the ways in which that historical moment can illumine events in our own contemporary context. I'm deeply appreciative of the hospitality I've received from Miera and Randy Silverman and other faculty and their spouses. It has been good to be here at the U. I am grateful to the Office for Equity and Diversity and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for their role in sponsoring my visit here. It's a privilege to come to this community to share some reflections I have on the nature of human dignity and our common humanity, which have been developed through my study of Black slavery and the Holocaust. The title of this lecture is Slavery and the Holocaust, the Challenge to Human Dignity. As I speak of human dignity and its violation, I ask that you keep in mind not only the images that Dr. Stockton evoked for us, but keep in mind also the faces that are projected here on the screen behind me. I view these men, women, and children as part of a cloud of witnesses. They're concrete reminders of what I mean when I speak of dignity and defacement. When we look at their faces, resisting the temptation to avert our eyes, we can experience the claims that their dignity makes upon us. My thesis is simple. Human dignity makes ethical claims on us. Our individual well-being and the quality of our life together depend upon the degree to which we consistently honor those claims. Unless we do, by safeguarding the dignity of others, genocide and other crimes against humanity will become even more commonplace in our time. Despite the fact that the experiences of Black slaves and Jewish victims of the Holocaust span different places, times, and socio-historical contexts, both African Americans and Jews have known what it was like to live in a world in which their dignity was violently assaulted. The particularity of their respective experiences doesn't negate the fact that as members of the human family, they have shared the experience of dehumanizing oppression. I contend that their experiences offer important insights regarding the nature of what it means to be a human creature in the sight of God. Foremost among those insights is that the dignity of being human, made in the image of God, is manifested most starkly in the protest against the violation of that dignity, whether the assaults are physical, emotional, and/or spiritual. In my book, Plantations and Death Camps, I identify several experiences of dehumanization which Black slaves and Jewish Holocaust victims had in common. This afternoon, I'm just going to mention three. The first was their designation as pariahs in their respective societies. Forced exclusion of one group from the rest of society is a common tactic of those who practice systematic dehumanization. The pariah group is denied access to all the rights and responsibilities that accompany full participation in society. And whatever mistreatment is directed against that group is considered justified. Moreover, the justification of the mistreatment of the pariah group reinforces the pariah status of the oppressed. For instance, When Adolf Hitler came to power in the early 1930s, Jews were forced over time to relinquish their full participation in German society. They were forced to wear a yellow star on their clothing so that they would be easily recognized, and non-Jews felt free to practice discrimination against them. Their comings and goings were prescribed in ways that set them apart and alienated them from the rest of society. Furthermore, they were removed from their professions, their businesses and properties were confiscated, and they were excluded from public events. By the late 1930s, in less than 10 years, their pariah status was well entrenched in German society. African Americans have had their own experience of pariah status through their status as slaves and then later their experience of both legalized and de facto segregation. Exclusion was a hallmark of the experience of African Americans well into the 20th century. The United States Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, with its doctrine of separate but equal status between whites and blacks, ensured that African Americans were consigned to inferior public facilities such as transportation venues, restaurants, stores, public restrooms, and educational institutions. That systematic social exclusion was accompanied by a constant, relentless message of inferiority, which was reinforced through state-sanctioned violence. A second feature of dehumanization that Black slaves and Jewish Holocaust victims experienced in common was the particularity of the suffering of female victims. Now, the differentiation of the suffering of females and males in this context is not done to minimize the suffering of the one at the expense of the other. This differentiation, however, highlights that gender did add a dimension to the experience of dehumanization that warrants more attention than is often given. For example, under the system of slavery practiced here in the United States, Black women were subjected to the whims and debased desires of white males without recourse to legal protection. Sometimes female slaves were involuntary breeders for masters as a way of boosting the master's economic status. Too often, Black women suffered the trauma of having their children removed from them permanently. The life of a Black female slave of childbearing age was one of constant vulnerability. As the slave Harriet Jacobs reminds us in her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This particularized vulnerability of the female was an experience that female Holocaust victims faced as well. Jewish women were subjected to the humiliation of invasive strip searches, lewd comments, and unwanted sexual advances from camp guards. Moreover, terror awaited women who were pregnant while in the camps. Although some attempted to hide their pregnancies, once these women delivered, both the mothers and the infants were killed. Impending motherhood of Jewish internees was a certain death warrant. A third common experience of dehumanization was the vulnerability of African Americans and Jews of the Holocaust to gratuitous physical violence from members of their respective societies. Brutal beatings were not uncommon as a punishment for perceived transgressions. The pariah status of African Americans after slavery coincided with the emergence of a reign of terror from the Ku Klux Klan in the latter half of the 19th century. The lynching of African American males in particular, although there were females who were lynched as well, took on a circus-like atmosphere well into the 20th century. Despite the election of the first African American president of the United States in 2008, African Americans remain the most frequent victims of hate crimes. This is true despite recent attempts to cast the United States as a post-racial society. The Nazi attempt to eradicate European Jewry altogether remains an international high watermark of moral depravity. The slaughter of 6 million European Jews between 1933 and 1945 constituted a systematic state-sponsored killing of a minority population that was unfairly blamed for the economic, social, and political misfortunes of the German people. Now, Jews have been long-standing victims of periodic pogroms and persecution for centuries, but the Holocaust marked the culmination of historical attempts to settle the Jewish question once and for all. Beware when you become a question to be, or a problem to be solved. In countries invaded by the Nazis, the Jews were rounded up into ghettos, concentration camps, and gradually transported to killing centers. And even in the final months of the Third Reich, when it was clear that Germany's defeat was imminent, the Nazis forced starving and sick Jewish prisoners to walk hundreds of miles at the mercy of the elements. Approximately 250,000 Jews died just as a result of those death marches. Because of the danger dehumanization poses to our own existence, it's incumbent upon us to unite with others who seek to safeguard the dignity of all human beings. When we think of human dignity, we tend to do so with a human view of human beings at their best: whole, highly capable, physically robust, intellectually sharp, and attractive without obvious blemishes. The far greater challenge, though, arises when we dare to look at actual human beings in a particular state of dehumanization. It is in those acute places of degradation that we must dare to speak of the presence of human dignity if we're going to speak about dignity at all. To look deeply and theologically, we must accept the challenge of describing and defining dignity from the vantage point of the marginalized, the rejected, the oppressed. Viewing dignity from the underside of history leads us to contemplate whether or not dignity can be lost or taken away. This perspective forces us into the deeper questions, such as what makes and keeps us truly human? Is our dignity predicated on our social status, physical condition, or intellectual capacity? To what degree do our natural endowments influence the presence or absence of dignity? Through such questions, we are led to ponder whether or not we are ever justified in treating others in certain ways based on our fallible assessments of their value or worth. I'm a professional theologian, and that's the principal lens by which I reflect upon socio-historical realities. Therefore, this afternoon, I'm going to offer a religious foundation for understanding human dignity. I am also a practicing church historian, and I'm keenly aware of the sins of the practitioners of the Christian religion. I know where the bodies are buried. Yet, I believe that a religious foundation can provide a transcendent basis upon which to ground one's ethical stance toward others. It can help us to look beyond our individualistic needs and can help promote a basis for seeking common ground. It can encourage us to be more inclusive and expansive and to see ourselves as bound to each other in one human family. And this sense of relatedness can encourage us to see the wisdom of seeking common ground and recognizing the source of our interconnectedness. Having said this, let me be clear that to argue for a religious foundation for human dignity is not to deny that there may be valid non-religious foundations which could foster a commitment to safeguard the dignity of others. Let me also say that I don't contend that the religious foundation must be Christian. If my theological interpretation doesn't suit you, I strongly encourage you to find and use your own lens. Whatever fosters a sense of commitment to upholding the value and worth of every human being contributes to this righteous cause. My definition of human dignity is based upon the divine assertion found in the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27 to be exact, which says, quote, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness," unquote. By this divine assertion, namely the creation of the human in the image of the divine, we find a number of important theological implications for what it means to be human. The first is that a measure of glory arises out of this imprint of the divine on every human creature. It is this glory that I call human dignity. Second, because this imprint comes from God, human dignity is a gift. As such, it's an aspect of who we are as human beings which cannot be taken away from us by other human beings. Human beings don't have the power to give or take away divine grace. Even when we attempt to deny the presence of dignity in another, we violate but do not destroy that dignity. The inner cry of protest to this violation, whether we can hear it or not, testifies to the continuing presence of that dignity when the value and worth of another is threatened or even denied. Third, because of the gifted nature of human dignity and the human inability to destroy it, this dignity is present in every human being, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, sexual identity, religion, national origin, class, handicapping condition, or any other feature of diversity which we use, and we do, to discriminate against others. This dignity remains regardless of our abilities, capabilities, or disabilities. It is present at the beginning of life and remains at the end. If this theological baseline is used to establish the value and worth of every human being, then we have an imperative to protect human dignity whenever it's in jeopardy. There is a social dimension to this dignity, and this dimension is marked by a human need to have our personhood acknowledged by others. For a sense of well-being, we must have our dignity acknowledged, even as we acknowledge the dignity of others. This need for mutuality of acknowledgement is so powerful that when it's denied, it increases our physical suffering. It increases our experience of humiliation, degradation, and a sense of nothingness. This social dimension of dignity is an indication that our humanness is tied to every other human being. It means that in some way, our humanity is fulfilled in the presence of others who also know our value and honor our sacred worth. When we lose sight of this worth, it then becomes ever so easy to treat others or even ourselves as less than human. It may well be difficult for us to get a full sense of the concept of human dignity as representing the glory of the image of God in us in the abstract. So I would like to suggest that the human face is that concrete visual representation. Here I draw inspiration from the work of the late philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. The ethical demand to be viewed, to be acknowledged, and treated as fully human being can be seen in Levinas's concept of the face. Levinas himself was a Jewish Lithuanian survivor of a German prisoner of war camp. The Holocaust then was the backdrop for his work as a philosopher in France, and he believed that the philosophical task begins with ethics, and ethics begins in the face of the other. He maintained that the face of the other commands that we not remain indifferent to the death of the other. It is the face, it's in the face that we meet the biblical commandment, thou shalt not kill. Now, interpreters of Levinas are constantly warned not to confuse the Levinasian face with anything we might see. We're not to speak about the face as if it were a physical, observable part of the body. For Levinas, the face is the channel through which otherness presents itself to us, and as such, it lies outside and beyond what can be seen or experienced. Hence, at the great risk of rendering Levinas's concept of the face more concrete than he would ever have chosen it to be, I am going to speak of the importance of the physicality of the face in relation to human dignity. And I'm compelled to do so by the nature of these witnesses. They cry out for a discussion that is concrete and physically palpable. For me, the face functions as a synecdoche. That is, the face not only stands for the actual face, but the entire body as well. The visual testimony of these witnesses indicate in poignant and graphic detail that the attempt to violate the dignity of other human beings is often vividly reflected in the body. Whether it's the sting of a lash, the searing burn of a bullet, the sharp pain from a machete, or the denial of nourishment, it is often in the realm of the body that we are first abused. Thus, the human beings that you and I encounter in our daily walk confront us in the form of the face with a visible, concrete manifestation of their value and worth in the eyes of God. And this worth suggests a sacredness that we must not breach. If we dare to look closely, the sacredness that we see in the face of another says not only, as Levinas says, thou shalt not kill, but also says, you are connected to me. It's through the face, through the body, that our dignity as creatures of God shines forth and calls us to respond with respect, to treat each other as having inestimable value. Moreover, insofar as each one of us bears the mark of God, this mark connects us theologically to each and every one. And this connection is the link that makes it incumbent upon us to be keepers of each other. Thus, what happens to you concerns me, and what happens to me concerns you. This connection transcends familial ties, racial and ethnic categories, national allegiances, and whatever distinctions we would choose to make, which encourage us to divide the world into us versus them. Yet, even as we speak boldly about this dignity, we must also at the same time speak truthfully about the threat to that dignity through the actions of individuals, groups, communities, and nations. And it is these acts that I call defacement. Simply stated, defacement is the assault on the dignity of another. To deface someone or a group is to deny them the respect and honor due to them by virtue of their full humanity. It's to fail to see their sacredness. It's to dismiss a person or persons as having no value or worth. It's a challenge to their right to exist. And the range of acts that can be classified as defacement are broad, from the humiliating snub of a clerk in a store all the way to genocide. Individually or personally, we commit defacement when we render people invisible, inconsequential. Defacement can also be corporate or communal when our communities engage in activities that exclude designated others from the advantages of a decent life by denying them access to the benefits of good neighborhoods, decent schools, and living wages. Defacement often becomes codified in legislation and embedded in social policies, which make it legal and the natural order of things to keep minorities from the opportunities needed to participate effectively in national life. Defacement is most visible when one group in a society decides that another group is unfit to live. One of the most important lessons I believe we can learn from the Holocaust, from slavery, and other crimes against humanity is that we must safeguard the dignity of every human being. And for those of us who are alarmed by these kinds of crimes, we have the responsibility to recognize, to embrace, and propagate the notion of the importance of safeguarding human dignity because of the bond we share as fellow human beings. Historically, an important step in the protection of human dignity is attentiveness to the presence of ideological thinking and or propaganda in the public sphere, which makes dehumanizing practices socially acceptable. White supremacy and racialized anti-Semitism became ideologies of death that robbed African Americans, robbed Jews of their right to participate fully within their respective society. The enduring legacies of these ideologies illustrate the price we pay when there is no commitment to safeguard the dignity of others. Attentiveness to history should lead the privileged among us to inquire, who's to say that at some point in time we too will be subjected to the same determinations and assessments regarding our fitness to live? The persistent challenge for those who have the courage to embrace the ethical imperative to safeguard the dignity of others is that we struggle with the human tendency to manufacture differences or capitalize on the diversity within the human family to pit one group against the other. In our discomfort with diversity, we strive to establish that one social group is superior and render other groups inferior. And economic, social, cultural, and political upheavals seem to make such striving inevitable. Hence the tendency to problematize the existence of groups in society makes our vigilance necessary. It also makes it incumbent upon us to refuse to acquiesce to expressions of intolerance that place the dignity of others in jeopardy. The propensity for humans to do evil and avoid the good vexes all who truly love justice and thirst for right relationships, despite the fact that there are and will be those among us who, for various reasons, succumb to hatred and hostility toward other groups. Those of us who can resist the human impulse to sow seeds of hatred must be willing to become evangelists, if you will, for the protection of the value and worth of every human being, even our perceived enemies. Perhaps, though, what might be worse than those who are caught up in ever-increasing spirals of hatred and violence are those who do not hate, but nevertheless stand by in silence and inaction toward the breaches of peaceful and just human interactions. In hindsight, our knowledge of the Holocaust during the 12 years of Nazi rule illumine even more clearly the bitter truth of the old saying that's often attributed to Edmund Burke, quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing," unquote. The German Lutheran pastor, Martin Niemöller, articulated the tragedy of indifference when he penned the following poem from the context of Nazism. The poem goes like this: "First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." In another context, a different historical moment, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King also understood the moral harm perpetrated when those of goodwill fail to protect or defend those whose dignity comes under assault, when he wrote, quote, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God," unquote. Now, King, faithful to the prophetic ministry in which he was called, sought to impress upon the so-called good people, clergymen even, that the time was now to do the heavy lifting of delivering the southern United States out of the quicksand of racial injustice and onto the solid rock of human dignity. The truth is that indifference and complacency are the enemies of justice, because the pursuit of justice requires the passionate engagement of those who dare to care. When good people are unwilling to speak out for the vulnerable or intervene in the face of oppression or take risks on behalf of those who are socially crushed, then they are no longer good. It's unfashionable in some academic circles to speak about a common humanity, to avoid the transgression of hegemonic universality. And while I concur that we must be resistant to such tendencies, I contend that there are issues within the global community that compel us to consider our common humanity, even as we engage in important, meaningful reflection from particular socio-historical contexts. Incidentally, it seems to me the real challenge is to perfect the dance between particularity and universality, not to deny the value and importance of considering either one, in our academic discourse. As an African American woman from the United States, one could raise the question to me, why is it that I feel a theopolitical commitment to vigilance against the growth of anti-Semitism? I could devote my energies for vigilance solely on the plight of African Americans who bear the scars and still carry the weight of the burden of the ideology of white supremacy on their shoulders. However, I know that the ideology of anti-Semitism, like the ideology of white supremacy, is an enemy of human dignity. Just as the impact of white supremacy is my business, the impact of anti-Semitism is my business as well. None of us can afford to circumscribe our commitments to our own silos of concern. In the need to redress the violation of the dignity of one's own community of belonging, we can lose sight of King's insight when he said, quote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny," unquote. The truth of his observation is even more evident geopolitically in our time through globalization. His observation has always been theologically true, for we are bound to each other by the reality that we are creatures, all of us, in the image of God. Hence, there is no room for ideologies, mindsets, practices that insist that some groups are less human than others. If you and I truly recognize what's at stake here, then we know that King was right when he said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Therefore, embracing our common humanity is an important step towards safeguarding the dignity that belongs to each one of us. I'm nearing the end of this talk, believe it or not. I'm coming down the pike. Safeguarding human dignity is both an individual and communal act, and I see 5 practices that we can adopt to safeguard the dignity of others. We can do so through making a theopolitical commitment to protect human dignity, exercising self-critical examination, bearing witness, maintaining vigilance against white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and other ideologies of death, and finally engaging in the practice of radical hospitality. And I'll just briefly describe what those practices involved. The first, a theopolitical commitment. What's a theopolitical commitment? It's a theological and political commitment. I'm an academic and we love to make up words. I believe it does take a theological commitment to safeguard the dignity of fellow human beings. And the grounding, this theological grounding, can supersede our petty prejudices. It can relativize our limited perspectives and transcend our egocentrism. This, I think, to do that requires a theological foundation that recognizes the value and worth of every human being as a gift of divine grace. Understanding humans arising from a purposeful creator who stamps the divine image on each one of us captures not only the value and worth of each human being, but also underscores the nature of the tie that binds us to each other. It can illumine the reality that we are enhanced or diminished to the degree that others are enhanced or diminished, and offers us a powerful incentive for commitment to the well-being of others. That's the theological part of the commitment. But it also takes a political commitment as well. Our theological commitments with regard to our relationship to God and to fellow human beings determines our values. The economic, social, cultural, and political commitments we make arise from those values. Our values then determine the way we treat each other, not only personally, but also collectively. What we truly value is reflected in the socio-political decisions we make and the policies, laws, and customs to which we submit ourselves. Whether we are weighing in on welfare reform, immigration, renewal of voting rights, national health care reform, our decisions with regard to these issues reveal the degree to which we are committed to upholding the dignity of all, or whether our concerns are limited to me and mine. A theopolitical commitment to human dignity is needed to help safeguard the dignity of all. The second practice is self-critical examination. One of the major problems with ideologies such as anti-Semitism and white supremacy is that they constitute more than personal beliefs and attitudes. They tend to permeate the ethos of a society because they become embedded in customs, laws, and public policies. Consequently, as members of society, we imbibe this stuff, even when we do not consciously subscribe to the ideology that informs it. That's why it's crucial for us to engage in periodic self-critical examination, not only of ourselves as individuals, but also as members of various groups within society. It's fortunate, and this reflects that there has been substantive change in the United States. We live in a time when many people are somewhat embarrassed to be accused of being racist or anti-Semitic. This indicates that people at least find these labels repugnant, even if they have difficulty applying those labels to their own attitudes, beliefs, and conduct. But the willingness and the courage to look within as well as without are indispensable in being attentive to the ways in which things we say and do can violate the dignity of other human beings. Third, bearing witness. Being a witness is retelling the life stories of communities, and it's invaluable as a way of promoting regard for human dignity. Recounting history, telling younger generations about events such as the Holocaust, Black slavery, the modern civil rights movement, the Rwandan genocide, the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia, the killing fields of Cambodia. All of these things must be told often. As I look out at the audience and see so many young people, and I'm so heartened in a way, but I realize for many of you, this stuff is ancient. New generations emerge who are unfamiliar with the stories and must hear them for the first time. And even those who have heard the stories need to hear them again. It's not enough, though, to tell or retell the stories. We have to also explore the causes and significance of them in order to discern the ways in which our current context exhibit some of the warning signs that we should address. Hence, I found it wonderful that in Holocaust remembrance, that this community made an attempt to explore what possible connection there could be between the Holocaust and the recent events in Ferguson. Undoubtedly, though, the practice of bearing witness will evoke resistance from those who resent the reminders. With respect to the Holocaust, there are people who want to minimize its tragedy and impact. There are even people who contend that it never happened at all. There are people today who become irritated or impatient whenever African Americans lament the trauma of slavery and the legacy of inequality, scars which they still bear. Silence about the past and acquiescence to the psychological bullying that would lead us to consign the past to the past without acknowledgement of historical wrongs leave us ill-equipped to address the ways in which anti-Semitism and white supremacy reassert themselves in subtler guises. The silence and the forgetting leave us prone to offend again and again. Fourth, vigilance against anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Even when we are able to neutralize the prejudices we may harbor against certain groups within our own hearts, our responsibility doesn't end there. Our vigilance must include a refusal to acquiesce to attitudes and actions that foster and perpetuate the denial of human dignity within our families, our workplaces, our social interaction, our school campuses, and even the wider public sphere. Our tolerance of highly inflammatory, irresponsible political rhetoric that degrades targeted groups in our society leaves us all vulnerable to the perpetuation of an ethos of us versus them that fuels genocidal practices. If we're complacent within our socio-political context, we become bystanders in the public sphere. As bystanders, we just merely observe and tolerate evil within our midst and stand by and do nothing. The lessons from the Holocaust should make it clear that we can't afford to maintain the status of bystanders without losing our moral integrity. Fifth, the practice of radical hospitality. When we're safeguarding the dignity of others, we're being proactive, even as we examine ourselves and we remain vigilant within the socio-political sphere. Even more is required of us. Yes, it is hard work to safeguard the dignity of others. The practice of radical hospitality, it exemplifies this proactivity, especially when it is extended to those who are different from us. Hospitality, and I know you all know about hospitality. This has been a hospitable place for me. It means opening ourselves to others, welcoming them in to our metaphorical and actual borders, expresses our commitment to human dignity in very concrete terms. It also renders us vulnerable and takes us out of our comfort zones that shelters us from getting to know others for who they are and not for what we project them to be. Radical hospitality, which stretches the bonds of mutuality and reciprocity, change who we think we are and leads us to transgress false boundaries. This spiritual practice of inclusion has the power to illumine just how deep our theological ties are to each other and makes our mission to safeguard the dignity of others just that much more rewarding. I am near home plate here. These suggested practices for safeguarding the dignity of other human beings by no means exhaustive. Although this discussion has articulated a response to the challenge from a Christian perspective, I contend that communities of faith from other religious traditions which share the same concern for human dignity can and should consider their own theological responses to this challenge. Even as we hold diverse beliefs about the nature of the divine, and we may ritualize our beliefs in different ways, to the extent that we are willing to unite in the common goal of protecting human beings, we could make significant progress in rendering crimes against humanity a thing of the past. And I urge this particular community to exercise leadership in this area, to seek to unite with others, whether from secular or religious groups, regardless of where they're from, if they're committed to an alternative vision of life. Life can be better for us here. It doesn't have to go this way. The faces of those projected on the screen and the countless millions like them, past and present, are reminders that human dignity makes ethical claims on us. Our individual well-being and the quality of our life together depend upon the degree to which we consistently honor those claims. Unless we do, the lessons we can learn from remembering the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity will be squandered, and the shame will be on us. Thank you so much for your attention this afternoon. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Would someone like to pose a question?
Conversation.
Oh yes, a conversation might be better. That's a point. Please.
When you discussed theopolitical measures or actions, I'm wondering, does that encompass or tie in with truth and reconciliation? And by saying that, I've only heard that phrase, and I'm curious about what it entails. So I don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, the truth and reconciliation measures or movement attempted to deal with what has taken place in Africa. And that certainly can be one expression of a way of theopolitical engagement. The idea was for those who were involved in the acts of crimes of inhumanity were encouraged to come forward and confess their guilt, and not only just to say, I did this, but to in detail admit to the wrongdoing that they were engaged in. And there were certain problems with that, have been certain problems with those models, because it's very difficult to have perpetrators and victims in the same context. Because by saying words and confess, those things do help, but there are wounds, psychic wounds, that take a long time to heal. You just don't get over it. I know people would like people to get over it, but you just don't get over it that easily. But the problem is, or the challenge is, what steps do we need to take for reconciliation after such egregious acts have destroyed the fabric of a society? And that's very difficult, but I think it marks an important theopolitical step going forward. But, you know, we really want, there's often a push for reconciliation that goes, you know, so fast. Let's, you know, I work often in terms of groups or organizations that are agitating for racial reconciliation here in this country. And the desire is to move past the enmity between groups without dealing with not only what happened in the past, but how the legacy continues in many ways, and without any indication of real, I'm going to use the theological term, metanoia. That is a profound and very deep turning or repenting from what you have done in the past that totally reorients your thinking going forward. You can't talk about reconciliation if the vestiges of certain ideologies persist in a culture. But it does, the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation movement does constitute a step in that direction. Thank you for that question.
So I've always been intrigued by the face and Levina on the face. So a couple of questions about that. Mm-hmm. Wondering about your whole take on representation, you know, what it means to have, at least in this case, of course, the faces on the screen, mm-hmm. so that we don't have that direct contact being mediated through tropes of representation where there has to be enough, you know, inside the frame of the picture probably to indicate that we are in a concentration camp or this is a slave, and then therefore you get into these sort of characteristics that actually have to show up in the photograph to sort of mediate that contact. So that's one question about representation. And then this really question I think came up for me at the panel yesterday, you know, and I think Bruce was doing a lovely job in trying to sort of talk about how, you know, with say slavery supposedly in the past and the Holocaust supposedly in the past, but we look at these conditions for people now, and one of the terms that critical theorists will use is slow death or chronic lethality. That what we're watching is, you know, poverty and many other sorts of forms actually literally change people's neuroendocrinology, so that the new science on poverty sort of goes in this direction. And there may not be a face to go with that. In other words, can we necessarily see that on a face, or how do we find these effects of slow death? What are our responsibilities? How far do we go to saying that the state is executing people now at the level of just simply withdrawing resources,
Yes.
that is state execution?
Yes.
You know, would you feel comfortable going that far to accuse the state of actually executing its citizens now by its withdrawal of resources. So that's sort of a bundle of things, the question of the representation of the face, the question of slow death, and then our responsibility in relationship to very slow forms of state execution.
Those are kind of questions that could keep one perennially occupied, at bare minimum, in a semester-long seminar. But they are important questions. I have to wrestle with the challenges and problems of visual representation. There are lots of scholars who are working on that, and as I continue to engage their thoughts on it, I might need to modify, clarify, adjust. But it seems to me that when you encounter people, the attempt of, I was very frustrated as I was crafting this notion of human dignity, because for me it's so crucial that, that I be concrete. I cannot stand over being overly abstract, because it obscures what's really there. But how do you make this concrete? And I found the work of Levinas somewhat helpful, although he was incredibly frustrating as well. And so I took certain liberties. But it is something. We need something. And perhaps I will, or others of you can think about other ways in which you may be able to access concretely what compels you to respect the other as a full human being. I'm open to whatever works, but that's when I go to consultations and workshops at the Holocaust Museum, it's a question that comes up all the time. Your second question, my aim, my concern is that in our thinking about that which really points to our value as being of sacred worth, that challenge to see others that way helps us to begin to think through the ways in which we order our lives as individuals, as communities, as nations, etc. Leads us to ask, are these things supporting or upholding dignity, or are they not? If you begin to use the notion of human dignity as an entree into examining one's values and actions and decisions, I think it is much easier for us to determine whether a law is a good law or a policy is a good policy, whether we can say our government is or is not supporting human beings. The task of getting us to even think that far without lodging certain charges against the state, I think there's time and place for that. And I think that that's a necessary step along the journey in terms of addressing social and systemic structural issues and naming them for what they are. My task right now is to struggle with getting people to think seriously about these things, and to reckon with them, particular people who profess to have a religious allegiance to God. I'm just sounding wherever I can, but I think that can become a powerful way of naming what is actually going on. We need multiple ways of getting people to see what's there. My piano teacher, when I was a little girl, in sight reading, would say, and I'd hit a bad note, eyes to see and cannot see. Many of us just don't get it in the urge to protect me and mine. But as I hope people can think about and realize, as they might say in my old neighborhood, if I go down, you're going down with me. We have a stake in this, and so I feel sort of like an evangelist. But I am very much encouraged by young people who are listening and thinking about these things. They're not yet jaded, and that keeps me going. But you should come to the sessions at the museum. Thank you for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
You said something about keeping the memories alive of the stories of the Holocaust, for example. And I found it a challenge in teaching history to not, sometimes, especially young children or young people, they don't have any connection to the stories anymore, so they get tired of hearing them. So could you recommend something, for example, because you said sometimes people would not acknowledge the trauma of the African American people, for example. So how would you recommend to deal if somebody is kind of ignorant to these kind of issues?
Well, there are, all sorts of resources available that people can go to learn about these issues. With regard to African Americans, I think it's important as we teach, particularly when we teach the history of the United States, that we convey to our students that you cannot talk about the history of this country without talking about the ways in which the assault on the indigenous population and the use of slave labor is a part of the story that they must understand. And getting people to recognize here in this country that Black history is American history. It's not just history for African American. Creative ways of getting people to see that it's in their interest to know about these things. And that's a challenge, to do it creatively. But I think there are lots of resources. People connect by hearing stories. I think ways in which the storytelling of our students can illumine ways in which they may have had experiences that in some way, large or small, can connect to a larger story that stirs up an empathetic imagination such that it can heighten a sense of curiosity about how all this fits together. But I really appreciate your struggle. I teach church history and toward the end, we do deal with the civil rights movement. And as I indicated earlier, I'm teaching students now for whom that is ancient history. Even African American students who we're past that now, or they don't want to, you know, they don't see the urgency of that. We must find ways to use history as a way of illuminating the connections between what has happened in the past to what is happening here and now. Because there is a way in which you get a repetition of sorts, of things that we don't want. But I salute and appreciate your challenge. But there are lots of educational texts, people who are writing to help to bring this history alive within the African American community. But certainly the Holocaust Museum is a fount of resources that can help attract new audiences to encounter this history. If you want, I can give you my card and afterwards, and maybe we can engage in email conversation to point you specifically. Sure, happy to.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful, I would say, challenging, provoking, thought-provoking talk. I was curious that, given your background and interest in human dignity, that the one word you never used was love. Mm-hmm. I never heard it. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether it's because you did not want to be abstract, whether it's because it's an academic community, but as a theologian, you know that the Bible says that love is the greatest of all of the other qualities. Mm-hmm. And when I believe it is Jesus was asked about the commandment, he said, you love God and you love your fellow man. Mm-hmm. And it's not a criticism. I just want to know, I mean, I heard it indirectly mm-hmm. throughout mm-hmm. your talk, mm-hmm. obviously, mm-hmm. but I never heard the actual use of the word love.
That is a question that will take me back to my desk and ponder the notion of dignity, particularly as it relates to the concept of love as we hear it talked about in the New Testament. I think that's an important avenue to go. I think that there wasn't anything deliberate about not employing that term, but I would need to really explore how I would articulate the nature of love. I think that that's an important and incredible element that can widen the discussion. So I thank you for adding to the list of things that I want to do as I expand it. This is organic, it's growing, but that's a great question. Thanks.
I have a question. You want to go ahead? I have a question. Thank you for your wonderful talk. It's very informative and constructive. My question is related to the notion of when the oppressed become the oppressors, which I don't seem to understand what it means, what it really means. But my question is, what condition creates that possibility? And I was thinking of the state of Israel when you were talking about the Holocaust, and the question of the Palestinians and all the immigrants in Israel,
yes,
whose rights have been
yes
abused, disrespected.
Yes.
Thank you.
I have, in fact, as I was delivering the lecture and talking about the plight of the Jews, the situation in Palestine, with the way the Palestinians are treated, was very much on my heart and mind, and how to make sense of how an oppressed group can become the oppressor. Oppression is a human characteristic. It is something that as human beings who acquire power and abuse power have a tendency to do. It is not limited to white people. It is not limited to Germans. It's not limited. Our streets are filled with blood from people who exercise oppressive power. And I think the situation with Israel and the Palestinians is complex. I don't think our media help us to address the issues or reflect on the issues in a way that's always helpful. But it's obvious that if you have any access to what is going on with regard to the Palestinians, the question of how can Israel do this arises. I think the element of needing to secure for a sense of security in a world in which Jews were often made and pushed to the margins, being in a region in which you have neighbors who have sworn that they will not rest until Israel is pushed into the sea, doesn't help. But if you look at the plight of the Palestinians, then the question is there. And so the only answer I have in terms of why this kind of phenomenon would happen is that it is something because of our nature, the corruption in which we have a tendency to misuse and abuse things that are good, that we are insecure and want to amass things for ourselves at the expense of others, that you're seeing a human pattern here. And the challenge is to what extent that we're going to respond to the plight of the Palestinians in that context. Why are we continuing to allow this to linger on? That's a current challenge for us. But I thank you for that question. It's something that the museum is often asked these days as they go through the permanent exhibit of seeing what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and the 5 million others who were also slaughtered as well. The natural question comes up. What about the Palestinians? And the museum is having private conversations among the staff, but there have been some of us who are urging an opportunity for more public discussion about this situation in light of what happened with the Holocaust.
One more question? Okay. Today, how, as like a global society, do you think we can address certain groups that are arising that have these ideologies that don't really believe in universal human dignity? I'm thinking kind of about ISIS. I think Israel-Palestine is a great example that I think the Israelis are treating the Palestinians horribly to some extent, but it's very complicated. How do you think, as a global society, we need to address like problems like this?
If I had the answer to that, I would have a lot of power and money, but it is a fair and good question. And I think it starts at dealing in the local area, paying attention to current events, what's happening, and seeing how issues are framed. I think it also involves connecting with groups globally who are trying to deal with these issues. And so there's not one step that's going to lead us in the promised land. But this global piece is, and the reality that in many ways our interconnectedness is becoming more and more obvious. People such as yourself who are concerned about these issues and want to know how can we begin to change the tide, or what can I do personally, or what can people I know do personally. There are lots of organizations that are raising these issues, and one of the important things is learning more about what is really happening, as opposed to the sound bites you sort of get here and there, which are very unhelpful, oversimplify, shape, and direct us to think in certain ways. We have to be sort of diligent in ferreting out ways in which you can find substantive, careful analysis of what it is that we're wrestling with. And through that, I think one of the positives about the internet can be that it can be a vehicle for connecting with other groups who share the same concern. But it involves a kind of spiraling out, starting with one's own stuff, dealing with the communities in which you engage, learning what you can, connecting with other people who are concerned about these things. And we can make a difference, I think, as the Catholic leader of the Catholic social worker movement from around the time of the Depression, Dorothy Day, said these changes that we are looking for come by little and by little. It's a long, arduous, sometimes painful, sometimes joyful journey to agitate and move toward more humane ways of relating to others. If you are interested in these kinds of issues, prepare to commit for the long haul. And that's not an easy task to do, because to engage in it without becoming, collapsing into despair, frustration, getting burned out, you need community to help, not just trying to go it alone. But I would encourage you to seek out avenues that can provide some ways in which you, even making your own decision about where, how you're going to work, where you're going to work, what kind of work you're going to do when you leave this place. All is part of the journey toward the commitment to struggling for the forces of justice. And I wish you well in that journey. Thank you for your question.
The dialogue continues at 2 o'clock with Professor David Darazotis, Director of Peace and Conflict Studies over at Social Work 155. Please join me in thanking Dr. Beverly Mitchell for her wonderful presentation today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So patient. Thank you.